300 feet above the Columbia River Gorge, the wind doesn't just blow, it screams. For 40-year-old technician Elias, it was supposed to be a routine brake pad replacement on turbine 42. But a catastrophic bearing failure has turned the massive blades into a runaway propeller. The vibration has shattered the external catwalk, and Elias is hanging by a single safety lanyard over a 300-foot drop. His radio is dead, his fingers are numbing in the 50-mile-per-hour gusts, and the steel tower is swaying like a blade of grass. He is a ghost in the machinery, waiting for the final snap. The sky anchor, the St. Bernard who held the line. Chapter 1: The Runaway Blade. Turbine 42 was a titan of the Columbia River Gorge, a 300-foot spear of high-grade steel designed to harvest the raw, untamed energy of the Pacific Northwest winds. To the world below, these machines are symbols of clean progress, but to the technicians who climb them, they are living, vibrating monsters. On a clear day, the view from the nacelle is breathtaking. On a storm-swept afternoon, it is a vertical nightmare of swaying metal and screaming air. Elias, a veteran wind tech with 15 years of high tower experience, was 3/4 of the way up the external maintenance ladder when the world began to shake. He was performing a routine brake pad replacement, a task that required the 300-foot blades to be pinned and stationary. But a catastrophic bearing failure deep within the gearbox had bypassed the primary safety locks. The massive blades, each weighing 12 tons, began to turn. At first, it was a slow, rhythmic creak, but within seconds, the gale-force winds caught the pitch of the blades. Without the resistance of the brakes, the turbine began to run away. The rotation accelerated beyond the design limits, reaching a tip speed that approached the sound of a jet engine. The harmonic vibration was so intense that Elias could feel his teeth rattling inside his skull, his grip on the steel wrung slick with sudden, cold sweat. The turbine was entering a state of mechanical resonance, where the frequency of the spinning blades matched the natural sway of the tower. This is the suicide note of a wind turbine. The steel tower began to whip back and forth in 20-foot arcs, a motion that began to shear the structural bolts holding the external catwalk together. Elias looked up just in time to see the upper landing peel away from the tower like a piece of tin foil. The catwalk vanished into the abyss, crashing into the rocky ridge 300 feet below with a sound that was swallowed by the storm. Elias was left clinging to a vibrating ladder that was now detached from its upper anchors. He was a speck of orange high-vis fabric against a sky that was turning the color of a bruised lung. Every pass of the runaway blade sent a concussive thump of displaced air into his chest, trying to knock him into the void. He managed to clip his primary safety lanyard into a secondary rail, but as the tower groaned under the centrifugal force, the rail began to warp. He was trapped in a death oscillation, suspended over a 300-foot drop with no path up and no safe way down. The sky was screaming, and the steel beneath his hands was becoming a living, bucking beast that wanted to throw him to the earth. His radio hissed with static, the electrical interference from the runaway generator was jamming his signal. He tried to call the base camp, but all he heard was the ghost-like scream of the gears grinding themselves into molten metal shavings. He was isolated in the red zone, a vertical island in a sea of wind, waiting for the final snap of the nylon rope that was now his only connection to life. Below him, the gorge was a blur of jagged basalt and churning water. Elias closed his eyes for a second, fighting the vertigo that threatened to shorten his breath. He realized the tower was beginning to tilt, the concrete base was being pulled by the immense torque of the blades. He was at the center of a mechanical heart attack, and the only witness was a creature who had walked with him to the base of the tower every morning for 5 years. Chapter 2: The Safety String. At the base of the tower, Atlas felt the catastrophe before he saw it. As a 160-pound St. Bernard, Atlas was built of muscle, mahogany fur, and a prehistoric intuition for structural distress. His breed was famous for finding travelers buried under 20 feet of alpine snow, but Atlas's world was the ridge. He could feel the micro-vibrations of the failing machinery through the pads of his massive paws, a low-pitched growl in the earth that told him the tower was dying. Atlas let out a thunderous, echoing howl that rose above the scream of the wind. He looked up, his deep brown eyes tracking the swaying silhouette of Elias. To the dog, the pack leader wasn't a technician, he was a limb of the pack that had been caught in a trap. Atlas moved to the very edge of the concrete pad, his heavy coat whipping in the 50-mile-per-hour gusts, his nose twitching at the scent of hot oil and ozone raining down from above. High above, Elias was struggling to stay conscious. The violent swaying was inducing motion sickness, and the cold wind was stripping the heat from his core. He looked down and saw the safety string, a secondary, 400-foot static line that had unspooled from his gear bag when the catwalk fell. The end of the line was whipping violently in the wind near the base of the tower, a thin orange thread dancing over the rocks. If that line stayed loose, it was useless. Worse, if the wind caught it and tangled it into the rotating blades, it would act like a fishing reel, jerking Elias upward into the 100-foot-long guillotine of the propeller. He needed that line to be taut. He needed an anchor. But the ground was a world away, and the human rescue teams were blocked 5 miles out by a mudslide that had turned the access road into a river of clay. Atlas saw the orange line. He didn't need a command, he understood the physics of tension. In the mountains of Switzerland, his ancestors had learned to pull sleds through the drifts by using their low center of gravity. Atlas lunged for the whipping cord, his massive jaws snapping shut on the heavy-duty carabiner at the end of the line just as it was about to be swept into the gorge. The line jerked violently as the tower swayed, nearly pulling the dog off his feet. But Atlas was a sky anchor. He dug his dew-claws into the soft mud at the edge of the concrete, his back arching as he took the slack out of the rope. He wasn't just holding it, he was winching. He began to back away from the tower, using all 160 pounds of his weight to create a stabilized guide wire. Elias felt the line go taut. The violent, erratic swaying of his body slowed as the tension from below provided a center of gravity. It was a miracle of geometry. The dog, standing firmly on the earth, was providing a counterweight to the chaos of the sky. Elias gripped the orange cord with his numbing hands, the vibration of the tower traveling down the rope and into Atlas's jaw, a shared pulse of survival. The technician began to rappel. It wasn't a standard descent, it was a desperate, sliding crawl down the vibrating skin of the tower, using the tension Atlas provided to keep himself from being slammed into the steel by the wind. Above them, the nacelle began to glow cherry red. The friction of the runaway gears was starting a fire. The clock was ticking, and the only thing holding the line was a dog who refused to yield an inch of ground. Chapter 3: The Earthbound Sentinel. The heat from the turbine began to rain down in the form of molten droplets of lubricant and sparks. Atlas didn't flinch. A spark landed on his thick fur, singeing the mahogany coat, but the St. Bernard remained a statue of mahogany and muscle. He knew that if he let go of the line, the tension would snap, and Elias would be thrown back into the death oscillation. Atlas was a living bolt, a biological component of the machine's final stand. Elias was halfway down, his hands raw and bleeding from the friction of the rope. Every time the tower swayed, the line would jerk, trying to pull Atlas forward. The dog's paws were buried to the dew-claws in the mud, his breath coming in heavy, rhythmic plumes of steam. He was a creature of the earth, fighting a war against the gravity that wanted to claim his friend. The wind reached a burst speed of 65 miles per hour. The turbine's blades were now spinning so fast they were invisible, a blur of white light and screaming air. The vibration reached a crescendo, and the first of the massive blades shattered under the centrifugal force. A 12-ton shard of fiberglass whistled through the air, crashing into the ridge 100 yards away like a fallen comet. The sudden loss of weight caused the tower to kick back in the opposite direction. The orange line snapped tight with the force of a whip. Atlas was jerked forward, his face hitting the concrete pad, but he didn't open his jaws. He held the carabiner with a lockjaw grip that ignored the pain. He recovered his footing, growling deep in his throat, and pulled back even harder. Elias was sliding faster now. The ground finally coming into focus through the rain and the sparks. He could see Atlas, a dark, sturdy shape at the bottom of the world, a mahogany beacon of hope. He realized that the dog wasn't just holding a rope, he was holding the entire sky in place. The structural empathy of the breed was in full display. Atlas was absorbing the stress of the tower into his own body. The gearbox at the top of the tower finally gave way. A massive explosion of fire and steel sent a shockwave down the pillar. The tower groaned, a sound like a giant breaking a bone, and began to list 5 degrees to the west. Elias was only 30 feet from the ground, but the rope was now smoking from the heat. "Hold it, Atlas," he screamed, though his voice was lost in the roar. Atlas didn't need to hear the words. He felt the shift in the tower's lean. He adjusted his angle, moving sideways to compensate for the list, keeping the line perfectly aligned with Elias's descent. He was a living winch, a master of tension who was outperforming the billion-dollar safety systems that had failed at the first sign of a storm. With a final, desperate leap, Elias cleared the last 10 feet, hitting the muddy slope at the base of the tower and rolling away from the vibrating steel. Just as he hit the ground, the remaining blades disintegrated, sending a shower of shrapnel into the air. Atlas saw his friend was safe. He finally opened his jaws, the orange line snapping back into the sky like a broken guitar string. Chapter 4: The Living Winch. The silence that followed the explosion was heavier than the noise. The turbine sat at the top of the ridge, a blackened, smoking husk, its heart having literally melted from the inside out. Elias lay in the mud, gasping for air, his body shaking with the aftershocks of the death oscillation. He looked at his hands, the gloves were shredded, the palms a mess of rope burns, but he was alive. Atlas approached him slowly, his gait heavy and exhausted. The dog's mahogany coat was matted with mud, oil, and ash. He let out a soft, low whine and nudged Elias's shoulder with his massive head. The sky anchor was back to being a companion. He began to lick the salt and soot from Elias's face, his warm breath a sharp contrast to the freezing wind that was still howling across the ridge. The rescue crews finally arrived 20 minutes later, having winched their way through the mudslide. They expected to find a recovery mission. Instead, they found Elias sitting on the concrete pad, his back against the silent tower, his arm draped over the neck of a St. Bernard. The lead ranger looked at the snapped orange line and the deep paw trenches in the mud. "How did you stay on the tower?" the ranger asked, looking up at the blackened skeleton of Turbine 42. Elias didn't look up. He looked at Atlas, who was currently occupied with cleaning a singed patch of fur on his leg. "I didn't stay on the tower," Elias whispered. "I stayed on the dog." He was the only thing on this ridge that didn't vibrate. The story of that sky anchor became part of the Columbia Gorge lore. The turbine company conducted an investigation that lasted months, trying to figure out why the smart brakes had failed and why the catwalk had sheared. They spent millions on new sensors and reinforced steel. But the technicians who work the ridge know that the smart brakes aren't enough when the sky decides to scream. Elias was promoted to a safety training role, his days of climbing 300-foot towers over. He spends his time teaching new recruits about tension, harmonics, and the physics of failure. But he also tells them about Atlas. He tells them that the most important safety equipment isn't something you can buy in a catalog, it's the bond that keeps you grounded when the world starts to sway. Atlas is a regular at the control room now, his massive frame taking up most of the space under the main console. He doesn't like the sound of the wind turbines when they reach a certain pitch, and the technicians have learned to trust his ears. If Atlas stands up and looks at a tower, they check the bearings. He is the vibrational conscience of the ridge. As the sun sets over the Columbia River tonight, the turbines are turning slowly, their white blades cutting the purple sky with a peaceful, rhythmic whoosh. Elias sits on the porch of the station, his boots on the railing, his hand buried in Atlas's thick fur. That sky anchor is asleep, his paws twitching as he dreams of holding the line. Because once you've held back the sky, the rest of the world is easy to carry. The higher we climb, the more we need a reason to stay grounded. If Atlas's battle against the wind moved your soul, help us honor the guardians of the high ground. Smash that like button to salute Atlas and every St. Bernard who holds the line when the sky tries to fall. Subscribe to Paws That Saved Lives, where we bring you the most thrilling and dramatic cinematic legends of nature's heroes. Comment Atlas below if you believe a dog's weight can hold back the sky.